Assalamu alaikum. Today you will learn about the request dispatcher in Java. Before moving on to any of the further topics, let me inform you that this is the 8th tutorial in the series of JSP and Servlets. So if you have not gone through the previous tutorials, I highly recommend you to go through those tutorials first and then come back to this tutorial. So without any further ado, let's get started. I have created a blank project over here. So in this we are going to create two servlets, and then we will be transferring data from one servlet to the other servlet using request dispatcher. So let's just create a class over here. I'll name it as first servlet. In order to make it a servlet, we have to extend this with HTTP servlet. Now we can use any method over here that we have discussed in the previous tutorial. So this time let's use doPost method. I hope you remember this and what it does. Similarly, we'll copy everything from here and create a second servlet. I will name it as second servlet. Click on finish, paste everything in here, rename it back to second servlet. Now that we have two servlets in place, let's create an entry point for the user. So I'll go to new and click on HTML file. I'll name it as index.html. So in this, what is going to happen, the user is going to enter his name, and then we will be capturing that name in the first servlet, and then we will be transferring the data or transferring the user's name to the second servlet using request dispatcher. Here I have created a form tag. Inside this we have one text and a submit button over here. Since we are using doPost method, we also need to mention here as well post. Alright, now just quickly create mapping tags for these two servlets. I'll go to my deployment descriptor. In here we can create the mapping tag for those two servlets. I have created the mapping tag for servlet 1, which is servlet tag and its mapping tag. Similarly, here is the mapping tag for the second servlet. The mapping that I have set is first for first servlet and second for second servlet. Now let's go to our servlets and write some code. This servlet is going to take the name of the user and send it to the second servlets using request dispatcher. So how we can do that? Simply by request dot, if you remember, get parameter name is username. Username, and we are going to store it in a string. We will say user name, and we will say request dot set attribute. Now this set attribute method sets some data in the form of key value pair. So if we want to set the data username, we also need to mention some key for this. I'll simply make a key which will say name key. And now let's create object for request dispatcher, because that's what we want. Request.get request dispatcher. In this we can pass the mapping for the servlet that we want to call. Since we will be calling second servlet and the mapping for second servlet is second, so I will say second. And if you remember, we also need to forward the request and response object, because as you remember, in the previous tutorials I have explained you how request dispatcher works. So if you have not gone through that tutorial, please go through that tutorial. And in the second servlet, what we are going to do, we are going to capture the key sent by the first servlet. So how we can do that? There we set the attribute, here we will get the attribute. Get attribute, and the name of the key was name key, and we will store it in a variable and cast this to string. And simply now we can print this on the web page. For printing, what we used to do, response dot get writer dot print name. Let's just say the username is so. Let's save everything and let's just run this and see what happens. Right click, run as, run on server, save everything. I will enter a name, let's say Tom, and click on submit, and we got the username is Tom. Let's just see what happens and how is it working. So when the user entered his name and clicked on submit button, the program searched for a web page called first. Since there is no web page in our application, it will go to web.xml. So it will search for first mapping, and it found out that first mapping is mapped with first servlet. So in the first servlet, the program goes to this Java file and execute whatever code has been written in here. Here we are simply catching the username and sending it to second servlet. So the program will search for a web page called second in our application. Since there is no web page called second in our application, therefore it will go to web.xml and search for a mapping. So it found out that there is a mapping called second, and the mapping is mapped for second servlet. So it will go to second servlet Java file, and in here we are simply catching the value of the key and printing it on the web page. And we are doing this all by requestdispatcher. Now this is a very simple example of how we can capture users' data and send it across multiple servlets in our application, and then later we can modify the data as and when required. So I hope you got a better understanding of how requestdispatcher works and how we can manage the users' data using requestdispatcher. In the next tutorial, we will be looking at send redirect and all of its ways of how to manage users' data. So see you guys next time.